Hey everyone, my name is Brady Witten and I welcome you to the Mid-City Sermon Cast for this week. We're continuing, actually wrapping up this week, our Encounter series where we look at different characters from the scriptures and experiences that they've had with God, and then ask the question of ourselves, how can we too enter into those places and have our own encounters with God? So let's dive in. So we're going to wrap up the Encounters series this week. And through this series, I've been inviting you to see different stories in the Bible of characters who had an experience with God. And more than just learn those stories, I really want us to explore how we too might enter into some of these spaces, some of these practices where we might have an encounter with God ourselves. And so today's story involves two characters who on the surface really couldn't be any different. And their names are Cornelius and Peter. And so this comes from the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called two of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heavens opened up and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. So, as I mentioned, Cornelius and Peter really are two very, very different people. Cornelius is a Roman centurion, so he's an outsider to kind of the Jewish religion and Jewish culture. And then you have Peter, who's a devout Jew and one of Jesus' first 12 disciples. So one afternoon, we're told that Cornelius has a vision, and an angel appears to him and tells him to send for Peter. Meanwhile, in a completely different city, Peter has a vision of his own. Now, I do want to say this because this is kind of like a fascinating, we want to kind of go, what's that sheet about and what's all the animals and what's going on there? And I don't have time to get into that in this sermon, but I did preach a sermon a while back called "Sometimes Love Breaks the Rules," and it talks about Peter's vision and that part of this story. So if you're interested in that, Google that, and you'll find it on the church's website. But today, what I want to focus on is a common element to both Cornelius and Peter's experience of God. And I think just to make it clear, Cornelius has this encounter with God or with the divine through this angel that appears to him, and Peter has an encounter through this vision that he's seen, and he hears a voice and communicates with God through that vision. But again, what I want to point out is there's something in common that both of these characters and both of these experiences carry. So when the angel appears to Cornelius, The angel tells Cornelius that something he's been doing has come up before God as an offering. Did you catch what it was? It was Cornelius's prayers, and we're told here that he was a man of prayer. And verse 9 in this scripture tells us that when Peter had his vision, he was also, at the time, praying. He was up on a rooftop praying. And prayer is the place or the practice that I really want us to think about today as a place that we can encounter God. So at its core, and kind of at its most basic, prayer is communication with God. It's talking to God. It's listening to God. Prayer can be spontaneous, like we can just, like while we're driving our car, we can say, hey, God. It can be a little more structured, maybe, like you get up in the morning and you have a devotional or some sort of more structured prayer that you do. Whatever it is, prayer is something that helps us to draw closer and draw into intimacy with God. But I do want to be honest for a moment in talking about prayer and make sure to say this. Prayer is not magic. Just because we pray something to God or we ask God for something doesn't mean we're just going to get it. It's not a formula where if we say the right words, somehow God is now obligated to do what we've asked. I've often said this, like, God is not a cosmic vending machine, right? You can't just go up to God and like, hey, if I put the right things in and push the right buttons, am I going to get what I want? God's not a genie, where I can like rub a magic bottle and God's going to come out and give me the wishes that I want. And if that's the way we approach God, and if that's the way we approach prayer, I'm just going to say this, you're going to be really disappointed if that's the way you kind of handle it, right? But if prayer is not first and foremost about us getting what we want, it's not just about us going, hey, God, this is what I want, will you do it for me? Then why do we do it? So here's the way I would encourage you to think about it. When you spend time with your friends, maybe your spouse, maybe your children, do you only spend time with them because you're trying to get something from them? I mean that'd be pretty bad if it was, right? That sort of very transactional way of looking at relationships. Hey, the only reason I'm hanging out with you is because I want something from you. One of the reasons that we spend time with others, I assume, I know in my life, is because I love them and I just want to spend time with them, right? And spending time with them is a way that I can invest in and grow that relationship. And the same thing is true of our relationship with God, and the same thing is true of prayer. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, said that prayer is the grand means of drawing near to God. And I want you to think about that. So this whole series is about drawing near to God and wanting to experience God more deeply. Well, John Wesley says the grand way of doing that is prayer. Prayer is not about manipulating God to get what we want. It's a way of opening our hearts to God, making space for God's presence in our lives. Mother Teresa says this beautifully. She says, prayer makes your heart bigger until it is capable of containing the gift of God, God's self. And I just love that image. Now listen, that's not to say, I don't want anybody to leave here listening to this and saying that, well, Brady says that God doesn't answer prayers. That's not what I'm saying. God does answer prayers. Not always the way we want. I think that's one of the tricky parts. But that's a topic for another sermon, and I don't have time for that. But just know, I do believe God answers our prayers, just not always in the way that we want. So in thinking about prayer, there's one thing I learned years ago that I have found extremely helpful to me, and that really is that there are two types of prayer. So the first type of prayer is known as cataphatic prayer, and the other one is known as apophatic prayer. And I don't want you to worry about those. They're big words. Unless you're a vocabulary person, Google them. I think they'll be written on your home sheet. But the important thing is not to remember those terms, but to remember what these different types of prayer are. So each of these types of prayer offer us a unique way to encounter God. So cataphatic prayer, the simplest way to think about it is prayer that uses words. So when we think about it, kind of a typical prayer that we're going to start, and we're going to go, Dear God, and then we're going to kind of talk to God and tell God what we want or share our feelings with God. That's known as cataphatic prayer. So it's prayer with words. And in this type of prayer, we do bring requests to God. We might pour out our fears and our hopes to God, maybe even our complaints. Maybe we could thank God and offer prayers of gratitude. Again, not because we expect God to do everything that we want, but because it's a way of sharing our hearts, sharing our lives, sharing our needs with God. And there are different types of cataphatic prayer. Some are extemporaneous, meaning you can just make it up. You could be in your kitchen cooking and just talk to God, and you don't have to have any formal or prepared words. Just talk to God like you would talk to a friend. There are also historical and liturgical prayers that you can say. So, reciting prayers from the Christian tradition, for example. So, one famous prayer that I think a lot of people have heard of is a prayer known as the Serenity Prayer. It starts with the words, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. You know that one? So, you can always take somebody else's prayers and pray those. You're using somebody else's words, and that can be a way to pray. And then you can also use Scripture for prayer and pray biblical prayer. So the Lord's Prayer is an example of that. So Jesus gave us this example of a prayer. You could take a psalm, which are often prayers, and you could use those words. But again, in cataphatic prayer, the big thing to remember is we're using words. So then there's another type of prayer that's known as apophatic prayer. And cataphatic prayer is prayer with words. Apophatic prayer is prayer without words. And this kind of prayer is about the stilling of the mind, the quieting of the heart, and really just growing silent in the presence of God. I often, whenever I think about this type of prayer, I always think about a girl that I dated when I was in 8th grade. So it was a school that we had to drive to. We didn't live in the same neighborhood, and she lived off someplace. And we were a couple, as far as you are a couple when you're in 8th grade, but we just talked to each other on the phone all the time. And probably after about 15 minutes of talking to each other on the phone, we'd said everything that we needed to say. And so we'd just sit there on the phone with each other and just listen to each other breathe, right? We didn't talk. Sometimes we'd watch TV on the phone together, right? And there weren't any words being exchanged between the two of us. We were just hanging out, right? And just kind of being with each other. And I think of that as apophatic prayer. So here are some types of apophatic prayer. There's a type of prayer called centering prayer. And this is where you repeat a word or a phrase over and over again as a way of centering your mind or centering your heart on God's presence. The word could be Jesus' name, just saying it over and over again. When I practice centering prayer, there's a phrase that I use that comes from a hymn, and that phrase is, Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. And I recite that over and over again to myself. Again, it's as a way of centering myself. You could also do something known as a breath prayer, where you just focus on your breathing. So you try to put your attention on breathing in, and then give your attention to breathing out. And you just sort of, and again, it's a way of centering yourself and stilling your mind. And then another way of doing it is just a silent meditation. If you just sit and you just try to still your mind. Now, I'll offer this. Have you ever just tried to sit and be quiet and just really kind of just hey, I'm just going to still my mind? If you have, you know that there's all kinds of stuff that swirls around in there, right? And I think that's where centering prayer is actually a helpful practice, because it helps us to get silent by focusing on something. But once you've gotten a little practiced in stilling your mind, it is possible to have moments where you're just sort of in silence and in stillness, but that can be a hard place to get to right off the bat. So again, by centering yourself on a word or a phrase, it has a similar effect to quieting and stilling your mind. We're actually going to practice a couple of these things, and so I hope maybe you can get a little more clarity if these are new ideas to you. So I do want to invite you now to practice and to try out both of these types of prayer. So the first type of prayer I want to invite you to do is this cataphatic prayer, or prayer with words, right? And so if you're with a group, and I know some people gather and they listen to these sermon casts in a group, what I want to invite you to do is, hit pause if you want to, or you can finish listening to me and then do these exercises. But if you want to, hit pause in a minute. But I want you to just take a moment, get together with the people you're in the group with, and take a minute and share your joys and share some concerns that you would like the group to lift before God. And then after you've shared those joys and concerns, just take a moment and pray for each other. Maybe everybody could pray to the person on their right. And just take a moment and lift those concerns before God in prayer. Don't worry about, trying to say the right words or beautiful words. Just have a conversation and lift the needs of your friends and your community before God in prayer. I do want to say this. If you're alone, then maybe what you can do in this moment is just think of somebody that you could pray for. You can always lift your own concerns before God, but just take a little bit of time and have that conversation with God. Okay, so I'm assuming you either unpaused or you're going to wait until I'm done. So the next thing I want to invite you to do, I actually want you to do with me so you don't get to push pause on this one. And that is to spend a little bit of time in centering prayer. So if you are familiar with centering prayer and you have a word or a phrase you use, I'm going to invite you to use your word or phrase. But if you don't have a word or a phrase, I'll lend you mine. And so again, what I do in this practice is to say this line: Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. And I find when I'm doing this, any type of meditative or centering prayer, that my posture matters. And, so I would encourage you to sit up straight. Hands are always an interesting thing. What do you do with your hands? I would put them intentionally on your lap. You could put them palms up, palms down, whatever's comfortable for you. I do think it's helpful if you have both feet, planted on the ground. If you're not going to get sleepy and fall asleep, you can close your eyes. And then again, we'll start just by breathing in, breathing out, and then begin to say that phrase to yourself: Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. And just continue to silently repeat that to yourself. One of the tricks to this is you will find yourself distracted. And so if you, again, think of the name of this type of prayer, centering prayer. You're going to recenter yourself gently on that word or phrase. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. And just spend a few moments doing that. Amen. And some people will say like if you really like centering prayer and you want to do it, that a 20-minute period of time is, you should set a clock for 20 minutes. I would suggest to you, if you're just starting out, don't do 20 minutes. Start with a minute, start with 2 minutes. I always feel like you want to, anytime you're practicing something new, stop while it still feels pleasant to you. Don't make yourself miserable doing it, or you won't want to come back to it. But I will say, after a time, 20 minutes is a wonderful time just to really rest your mind and rest in God's presence. And if you start your day that way or do that throughout your day, you'll find it has a wonderful effect just on everything. So I said each week as we explored these encounters that I would ask the question and help us to think a little bit about, so how do we know that it's God we've encountered? How do I know, with all the different things pulling at me and all the different voices and impulses I have, how do I know it's God? And so I think the story of Cornelius and Peter gives us kind of a really interesting way of thinking about this. So, Cornelius and Peter were people from two completely different worlds. And when they encountered God, God kind of stretched their understanding of who's in and who's out with God. And some barriers were broken down. Some really pretty powerful barriers were broken down from these two people in these two different groups. And I would suggest to you that when we encounter God, one of the things that happens to us is some of our barriers and some of our assumptions about other people are broken. They're stretched, and we begin to understand human beings and understand people in a different way. And what we begin to discover is that ultimately we really are all children of God. And so I would say to you, if you're involved in prayer and worship and studying the scriptures and serving, and God is in the midst of that, that what you'll see is a stretching of your perspective about who's in and who's out when it comes to life with God. So, do you want to encounter God in a deeper way in your life? Do you want to experience the peace and the purpose, the healing that only God can provide? There are lots of different ways that you can encounter God, but this week I really just want you to think about your practice of prayer and encourage you, if you don't have one, to develop a prayer practice. And know this, God is waiting to meet you there. See you next time, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Mid-City Church Sermoncast. If you'd like to find a home sheet, a resource that accompanies the sermoncast that has more questions to explore, the scriptures we use today, and more information, you can visit our website, midcity.church/sermoncast. If you'd like to support Mid-City Church by giving, please text the word GIVE to 225-307-0662. Thank you for your generosity, and we look forward to seeing you next week.